Good morning. My name is Dr. David Allen,
And I'm Lawrence Badgley.
and we're here to talk about the endocannabinoid signaling system. I'm a retired heart surgeon, and I have special expertise in the endocannabinoid signaling system because I had to learn about protecting the heart from oxygen-free radicals and the damage they cause. And we're introducing this new science now that we discovered about 30 years ago. It's called the endocannabinoid signaling system, or ECS, and it consists of these protein receptors. They're pieces of protein that cross every cell membrane, and part of the protein sticks on the outside of the cell and some of it's on the inside. And what happens is the outside part of the portion of the protein acts like an antenna and receives chemical messages. So people are familiar with estrogen binding onto estrogen receptors, and opiate receptors, insulin receptors, and cannabinoid receptors. And you can't see these proteins. They look like, under a microscope, they just look like little fuzz. So you can't really, it took us a long time before we had enough information to where we could prove that they were even there. And we're finding out that this system is a chemical communication system that regulates what's called homeostasis. And that means homeostasis is the ability to stay away from death. And so everything goes up and down. So your sugars go up and down, your pH goes up and down, your testosterone goes up and down. All the chemical communication systems go up and down. And if you go too high, you die. If you go too low, you die. And so homeostasis is the ability to maintain that level away from death. So if your pH gets too high, if your glucose drops too low, you die. And so the ECS is a regulator of homeostasis.
The endocannabinoid system.
Right. And what this does is it prevents people from dying. And the ECS regulates everything. And the reason is because it regulates the fuel that you burn. And if you burn sugar, you produce a lot of energy real fast, but you also produce a lot of exhaust, oxygen-free radicals. And that damages the cells. And so when you eat food, you break down the carbohydrates, the amino acids, and the fats in different systems, and they metabolize these substances, and they produce energy, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. That's the energy molecule of the cell. And they also produce exhaust, and the exhaust is oxygen-free radicals. And what happens is you take an oxygen molecule, and they're bound together with two shared electrons. When you metabolize glucose or fat or something, what happens is the oxygen comes apart and it becomes anatomic or atomic oxygen. And so that means it has an unshared electron, and it hates that. And so what it does is it tries to go to an electron donor. And so everything is like
That's a free radical.
So the free radicals attack your cell walls, they attack your DNA, and they cause oxidation damage,
Rust.
which ages you. So if you burn fat, you produce less oxygen-free radicals at a slower rate. And so you actually, burning fat is anti-inflammatory, and burning sugar is inflammatory. And so by manipulating these two things that you burn, you can control all cell functions. So you can control cell division, and you can control cell differentiation. So stem cells differentiating into heart muscle cells or brain cells or something like that. You can actually control that by manipulating the cannabinoid signaling system.
And this is important because all your cells are constantly regenerating. For example, your entire red blood cell system is replaced every 120 days, I think it is.
Right. So this will lead to advances where we can, when people have strokes and heart attacks, at some point in the future we'll be able to regenerate brain cells and heart muscle cells that will take over damaged tissue. And so this is a new science, and it's going to change medicine like no discovery ever made. This will save more human lives than any single discovery ever made, including the discovery of the sterile surgical technique. So more people's lives will be saved by this endocannabinoid signaling system than is currently saved by surgery. So this is a completely new field. There's articles and patents that prove that if you use cannabis for 20 years or more, that the incidence of diabetes is 66% less. So there's nothing that your doctor can give you now that currently decreases the incidence of diabetes by even 2%. The fact that using cannabis for 20 years decreases the incidence of diabetes by 66% is amazing. Now, and this is just, we don't really know the full extent, because this is how, just using smoking cannabis, if you eat cannabis, it may even have a higher protective nature of from diabetes. And so what people don't know, what the government doesn't want you to know, is that if you eat cannabis raw, it doesn't get you high. If you heat it in a cookie or heat it in a brownie or something like that, or light it on fire, it changes the molecules in the cannabis, and it's called decarboxylation. It boils off a carbon dioxide, and this new molecule, the THC, actually binds on the receptor and causes physiologic changes. So,
and that occurs at 220 degrees
right.
Fahrenheit, the decarboxylation.
So, so you can eat cannabis raw and it doesn't get you high. What that means is it makes it a nutraceutical. It has a nutritional value to it, but it doesn't hurt you, and so it protects your pancreas from diabetes. There's also U.S. patents that prove that if you use cannabis, or that if you give cannabidiol to animals and cause them to have a stroke by ligating their artery to the brain, what happens is if you give them cannabidiol, it decreases the size of a stroke by 50%. There are studies that show the same thing happens with heart attacks. It decreases the size of a heart attack scar by 66%. As a heart surgeon, I wish I had cannabidiol to have treated my patients. I would have had much better mortality and morbidity had I been able to give my patients cannabidiol preoperatively before I operated on them. And in the future, all surgery, not just cardiac surgery, but all surgery, they'll be pre-oping patients with cannabidiol, I guarantee it. So this is a new era. And so if cannabis decreases the incidence of diabetes by 66%, that means it also decreases all the complications that diabetes cause by the same amount. So if you owned a dialysis unit that was dependent on diabetic patients coming in to have dialysis, potentially cannabis could decrease your business by 66% or more. So you can understand the money that's involved in this science. There's people that don't want you to know what we're telling you now.
Right, and maybe we should show the patents.
Yes. All right. This is my book of all the cannabis patents, and I mean, it's just it's shocking, all the cannabis patents. Here's just a list of, these are all just cannabis patents. I know you can't read this, but there's a tremendous amount of them. This one on diabetes, 64% reduction in diabetes with cannabidiol. When they treated cells, when they treated pancreatic cells, beta cells that produce insulin, with chemicals that cause the destruction, if they gave cannabidiol, they had 87% survival. If they didn't give cannabidiol, it had 4 to 15% survival. So it made a difference when they attacked these cells. Only 4 to 15% survived if they were normal. If they had cannabidiol in them, 87% survived. So this is shocking news, and it's going to be an end to the diabetic industry. Because what we're going to do is we're going to start eating cannabis raw in our diet, and it's going to protect our pancreas from diabetes, it's going to protect our heart from heart attacks, and it's going to protect our brains from stroke. In the future, there will be cannabidiol pills that you carry in your pocket. If you have a stroke or a heart attack or a seizure, you're going to take cannabidiol and it's going to stop that. The insurance companies will pay for these pills and you'll carry them in your pocket just like nitroglycerin. This is the therapeutic uses of cannabidiol compounds. It's U.S. patent 2010/0158973. And it shows a 66% reduction in the infarct size, the size of a heart attack, with CBD. And so this is I don't know if you can see this or not. This is, if they give heart attack, they cause heart attacks in animal models. And this is the size of a heart attack you get if you don't have CBD. If you have CBD, this is the size of the heart attack that you have. Major difference in heart attack. Size of myocardial infarction. Here's a patent for the treatment of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Emphysema. There's currently no therapy for COPD at all. They can give you some bronchodilators, but there's nothing that you can do to make the lung better. There's evidence that cannabis makes lungs better. This is therapy with cannabinoid compounds for the treatment of brain tumors. Here's one on composition and methods for treating prostate disorders, so you can treat prostate cancers. This actually uses cannabis and shiitake mushrooms. This is the U.S. patent 6,630,507, cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. This is a genius patent that came out in 2003 by the National Institute of Health, which means it's a government patent. So the government patent, in this patent, under in vivo rat studies, let me see if I can find it. In vivo rat studies.
In vivo means in the animal, not any last word.
Example 7, it says that this data shows that infarct size was approximately half in the animals treated with cannabidiol. So the size of a stroke that was induced, when they induced these strokes, they were twice as big in animals that had no cannabidiol protection. So this decreases the size of a stroke by 50%. That's the difference in whether you can care for yourself after a stroke or not. 50% diminution in the size of a stroke is absolutely tremendous.
And they don't let you smoke marijuana in nursing homes.
Let's see here what I got. This is a method of treating liver disease. You can treat hepatic encephalopathy. There's patents for treating hepatic encephalopathy, autoimmune hepatitis.
That's cirrhosis. Hepatic encephalopathy, that's the consequence of cirrhosis of the liver from alcoholism.
It's proven in these studies that CB2 stimulation and CB1 inhibition.
These are the receptors.
If you inhibit CB1 and stimulate CB2, it decreases fibrosis in liver and also in heart. So a lot of therapy in the future may be from stimulating CB2 receptors and inhibiting CB1 receptors.
And the CB1 receptors are found in high density what tissues?
The CB1 receptors are found in high density in the brain tissue, and the reason is CB1 controls glucose metabolism. Everybody kind of knew that there was a bunch of CB1 receptors in the brain, but we didn't know why. Why is CB1 only in the brain and CB2 mostly found in the rest of the body? We didn't understand that. And it's because CB1 is involved in glucose metabolism, and the brain burns glucose primarily as a fuel, and the heart muscles and your regular skeletal muscles burn fatty substances, ketones, as a primary source of fuel. So the reason why all these CB1 receptors are in the brain is because the brain burns glucose and the rest of the body doesn't. So that's why they're mostly located there.
And these receptors recognize the cannabinoids from the plant equally to the cannabinoids that we make in our body.
Right.
So why don't you say something about the ones that we generate in our body, that are the
Okay.
same as the plant?
So you have endogenous cannabinoids, and there's probably about 5 of them that we
Endogenous means in the body.
in the body, and so there's anandamide and
AE2.
AE2, and
Anandamide comes from the Sanskrit for bliss.
the
That was
the
first
bliss
one.
molecule, right?
That's the first one discovered by Meshalom, the Israeli researcher.
Right. So your body makes these cannabinoids, and what happens is there's an enzyme system that makes them, there's an enzyme system that transports them, and there's the enzyme system that degrades them. Okay, and it's important to have all 3 of these, so you don't have too much cannabinoids, endogenous cannabinoids, and you have enough. So
It's a servo mechanism, a feedback loop.
it's a feedback mechanism, and there's been a couple tragedies caused by scientists who study these molecules, and we're studying molecular anatomy, okay? And so they know what shape these molecules are, and they can actually make new molecules synthesize new molecules that kind of fit these same configurations.
Yeah, they monkey wrench one of the parts of the molecule.
And so there was this. So scientists found out that cannabis makes you hungry. So they figured if they could block the receptor, that maybe it would be a diet drug because you wouldn't be hungry. So what they did is they manufactured this synthetic molecule that bound to the receptor and prevented cannabinoids from binding to the receptor. It's a receptor blocker. It's called rimonabant. And they tested it in Europe, and it was like the Nazi molecule because it did everything opposite of what cannabis does. So cannabis makes you happy. This molecule made you sad. Cannabis makes you hungry. This molecule prevented you from being hungry. And there were suicides, there was homicides, and they found out in rats that had this molecule that they had increased amount of colon tumors. So blocking the endocannabinoid signaling system by blocking these receptors turned out to be a disaster, because if the ECS controls homeostasis, the last thing you want to do is block homeostasis. So if you block homeostasis, guess what? You go closer to death. And so there was a bunch of deaths from the rimonabant, and they took that the medicine off the market in Europe, and they tried to get it over here in the United States, but they refused to have it. Recently, like last year, they had another endocannabinoid signaling blocking accident, and what happened was the enzyme that degrades your natural endogenous endocannabinoids, it's called FAH. This enzyme degrades your own natural endocannabinoids. So when they build up too much, it chews them up, and so they don't stay around in your system and cause too much trouble. And what happened was they made this drug that blocked that enzyme that degraded your natural endocannabinoids, and the thought was, well, if we block the degradation of these endocannabinoids, then they'll build up, they'll have more pain relief, and things will be cool. But what happened was, when they blocked this thing, the endogenous endocannabinoids build up to such an extent that it caused brain hemorrhage. And we're not really sure what the mechanism of this was, but the truth is this: if you block the ECS, you're going to have trouble. So the ECS is a regulatory system, and some people have well-functioning ECSs. They're endocannabinoid endowed, and there's some people that don't have good functioning endocannabinoid systems, and they're deficient in the endocannabinoids. And it could be from the either production or too much degradation, too fast a degradation. And the important thing about this is the ECS allows you to turn off stuff that you couldn't turn off. And so the ECS slows nerve transmission. And so if you have a seizure and the brain having seizures, and it's telling the nerves to shake, and it's giving signals down for your arms to have a seizure, the endocannabinoid signaling system has a way of signaling back to the brain to stop this. And so the ECS controls seizures by decreasing the nerve transmission. And so when you use cannabis, everybody has cannabinoid receptors, but when you use cannabis, the number of receptors you have augments. They call it upregulation of the endocannabinoid receptors. And so all of a sudden, when you start using cannabis, you have the more ability to inhibit parts of your brain that you couldn't inhibit prior to that. Now, what's the significance of this? You have really two parts of the brain. The cerebrum, the thinking part, which is the mammalian part, and you have the brainstem, which is the reptilian part. Now, the brainstem is responsible for keeping the animal alive, and it responds to things in fight, flight, freeze, and fornication. And so the brainstem controls these things, and the higher cognitive part, the cerebrum, is the mammalian part, and it's responsible for thought processes that make comparisons with different things and come up with a logical conclusion for whatever you're studying. Now, the midbrain is a control system that switches from the upper to the lower. And part of the midbrain is called the amygdala. And so when the amygdala is the fear organ of the brain. And whenever the fear organ is activated, what it does is causes what's called amygdala hijack. You should look that up. Amygdala hijack, what it does is it prevents you from thinking and switches on your brainstem. And so if the bear is trying to eat you, you don't have time to look at his eyes and think about his eye color. You got to get out of the way. So actually cognating during a time of danger is dangerous for the species. So turning off your brain, your upper brain, and being able to get out of the way is protective for the species. But it also is harmful because once you have amygdala hijack, you can't give information to that person. So if a person is in amygdala hijack and you try to tell them information, they reject any information as being annoying, actually. So, and we've seen this in human nature. Some people have the ability to turn off the amygdala, pot smokers, and some people don't.
Evel Knievel.
And so Dr. Bob Melamede has a theory about backwards looking people and forward looking people. They call them blips and flips. And the backward looking people have a constant fear. They don't like change. They like sameness. And they do things out of a reaction rather than cognition. And Dr. Bob Melamede feels that a lot of our leaders in the government are blips, they're backwards-looking people that have constant fear, that have the inability to turn off their amygdala. They can't turn it off. And when your amygdala stimulates, it sends an epinephrine rush. So this backwards looking people, the amygdala stimulated people, it's addictive because of the epinephrine surge. So the take-home message is, if you use cannabis, you'll have more endowed endocannabinoid signaling system. You'll be able to appropriately turn off the amygdala when it doesn't need to be activated, and you'll have more empathy to people. You'll be able to cognate. When you can't cognate, you can't have empathy. So
Thinking. And the amygdala, as you say, the midbrain is the connection between the upper brain and the brain stem. And the brain stem is where the autonomic nervous system is initiated.
Right.
The parasympathetic and sympathetic. And some of my clinical researches with cannabinoids indicate that there might be a relationship between the variety or the subspecies, the landrace strain, and whether it works more profoundly on the sympathetic or the parasympathetic.
Right.
And if you see sativas, that oftentimes causes reactions in the body like the sympathetic, whereas the indicas oftentimes cause reactions that are more like the parasympathetic.
We're in the infancy of this science, and the reason we are in the infancy of this science is because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, which means it had high potential for, Schedule I means high potential for abuse, not currently used for medical purposes in the United States, and not safe under doctor supervision. That's what cannabis is scheduled for. Amphetamines are Schedule II, are considered less harmful than Schedule I things. And so the significance of Schedule I means anything that's in Schedule I, doctors can't study without special permission that they don't give. It's a catch-22 thing. And so no doctor in the United States without special permission does any cannabis research. If we didn't have this law, there would be such a tremendous amount of research in this. We would know exactly how safe or dangerous cannabis would be, but we don't know that because the government has kept us in a scientific jail.
Dr. Allen, some people even posited that there's a cannabinoid deficiency disease. Maybe fibromyalgia is such a disease because in fibromyalgia, the current theory is that the brain dysregulates and represents pain with greater intensity than it should be realized, that they become more sensitive to pain. And perhaps the research that shows the efficacy of cannabis in fibromyalgia is replacing endocannabinoids or helping the endocannabinoids and properly reprogramming brain tissue. What do you think about that theory?
Well, since the ECS controls homeostasis, fibrous tissue is what holds the body together. So your muscles, if you try to put a stitch in a muscle, it really doesn't hold, but you can put a stitch in fibrous tissue, and it holds. And your fibrous tissue gets thinner or gets thicker depending on a bunch of factors. Okay, and the ECS most likely controls the production and degradation of fibrous tissue. So the ECS may control this fibromyalgia by controlling this regulatory mechanism that makes and degrades fibrous tissue in your body.
Excellent. Is there any other articles you want to refer to? You've created a library of cannabis articles.
This is this paper I have here is from Administrative Law Judge Francis L. Young, dated September 6, 1988. And he states in here as a summation that marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutic active substances known to man. And they give a lot of evidence of why that is, but there's no medicine made that has the same safety profile. Cannabis is so safe that you can't eat enough of it, you can't consume enough of it, you can't smoke enough of it to kill yourself. And it manipulates, there's almost no diseases that man has that cannabis doesn't help. And that we're finding out cannabis stops cancers, a bunch of different cancers. It stops heart attacks and strokes. It stops seizures. It stops irritable bowel syndrome and a bunch of other maladies.
Crohn's disease.
Crohn's disease, yeah.
And the reason you can't overdose with it because the brainstem, which is the center of origination of the autonomic nervous system, the lungs, the heart, respiration, so forth, does not, unlike other parts of the brain, does not have receptors for cannabinoids.
Right.
So you can't shut off your brainstem with cannabinoids.
So when morphine kills you, what happens, or heroin kills you, what happens is it binds onto the heroin receptors, the opiate receptors in your brainstem, and it lowers your respiratory system and your heart rate. And so it suffocates you basically. And cannabis doesn't do that because there's a lack of these kind of receptors in the brainstem. So.
Well, that was an excellent discussion, Dr. Allen. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.